Jeez, it's like IMAX. Dude, I'm sweating. Okay, well, thank you for that. Love the atmosphere in the room. Great turnout. Great to see. Yeah, do some breathing exercises right now. Please join us for a reading. So this is Matthew 18:19. And when Jesus saw great multitudes about him, he gave a command to depart to the other side. Then a certain scribe came and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." And this is Matthew 12:46-49. While Jesus was still talking to the crowd, his mother and brothers stood outside, wanting to speak to him. Someone told him, "Your mother and brothers are standing outside, wanting to speak to you." He replied to him, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" Pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." So that's the reading for today. So today's service is given by a distinguished individual. He's our national leader, renewed for another term. So please, you all know who I'm talking about. Please join me welcoming up Mr. Reverend Eli Lowe.
Okay. Merry Christmas, everybody. Christmas is much more exciting. I think I said in the email, when you have kids around, they just they look forward to it. We're doing the Elf on the Shelf, which is a lot of fun.
Much more expensive too.
Yes, definitely. So I don't even look at those numbers. I don't buy gifts. I'm not involved in the I leave that to a special someone to handle. I only have to buy gifts for one person and I can't mess that up. So but yeah, it's Christmas time. And so of course, because it's Christmas, I have to give a sermon about Jesus, right? And so the title of my service today is Jesus the Person. And I kind of joking there about having to talk about Jesus, but I've always noticed every year that it's the only time I really talk about Jesus, right? Is around Christmas time. And every time I give this service, I point that out, right? That I'm not talking about Jesus the whole year, or I'm not really thinking about Jesus that much the whole year. Unless, of course, I'm having an argument with a Christian, but those are becoming a lot less common. I don't think I've had any this year, but I was really asking myself this year, why is that? Why is it, why is kind of Jesus in the back of my mind and not really in the forefront of my mind? And I think the reason is there's a lot tied to the name of Jesus. And I don't necessarily want to call it baggage, but that was kind of my original, what I wrote down. There's kind of a lot of baggage attached to Jesus' name. And I think really there's a lot of theology tied to the name of Jesus, right? So when you say the word Jesus, it can mean a lot of different things, and there's a lot of connotations around it, right? And so I think it is important to kind of separate Jesus, the person, from the kind of ideology and the concepts around Jesus. And I think especially in our faith and according to the principle, that's a very, very important distinction that we have to make. And that I think it's very difficult for a lot of Christians to make. And that's why when we speak with Christians, it's a very, I don't want to say challenging conversation, but it's very much a debate. It's a very much a different view on who Jesus is as a person and what his life was about. And of course, it is very difficult to see Jesus as a person because we're really lacking the ability to have that kind of constant give and take that we have with other people, right? It's very hard to know someone if you can't have give and take action, if you can't have some kind of real relationship with them. And that's true for every person. The relationships are based on give and take. And there are a lot of Christians who try to have a real relationship with Jesus. And they can give testimonies about this, and they have spiritual experiences, and they really try to make Jesus something personal for them. And I would argue that the Christians that do that become, in many ways, the most successful Christians, the one who can feel Jesus on a very personal level and feel like Jesus is part of their lives. But still, Christianity conflates Jesus with God. And I think that makes that part of seeing Jesus as a personal person that you can have a relationship much more difficult. Because oftentimes people also are trying to have a relationship with God, right? And we're all trying to have a relationship with God. And that's different than having a relationship with another person, right? So, in comparison, it's much easier in our faith and in our community to have give and take with true parents, right? We have, when True Father was alive, he was actually always accessible. If you were anywhere within like a 2-hour drive of Father, you could go visit him every morning, because every morning he was giving Hundake. No matter where he was, no matter how old he got, almost every single morning, if you were anywhere near him, it was a public event and you could go see him, right? And he would speak for at least an hour, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. I think probably 20% of Father's life, people could see him in person in kind of an open way, right? So, and on top of that, we have videos, we have personal testimonies, people who were living with Father are still alive with us today, and they still share their testimonies. And same with Mother, right? Every week we get a video of Mother talking in public to a group of leaders or a group of members. So it's much, much easier for us to really have that kind of personal, some level of give and take and some level of like direct interaction with your parents. And I think the other thing in our faith and in our community is we really see Father and Mother as like the path to Jesus, right? In other words, we see that Jesus kind of passed on his mission to Father. And, Father received his mission from Jesus. So in a way, it was kind of passing on the torch, or it was like a relay race in some ways, right? So we see Father as like not the same as Jesus, but if you see what I mean, it's like, well, if we follow Father, we're automatically following Jesus, right? And there's also that kind of concept in our faith, right? So for us, it makes sense to focus on true parents, right? It's just kind of a natural thing that we do because they're here physically, because we see them, and because of, our faith about what Messiah means and what the term means. It's kind of a natural thing. So I'm saying all this because in context, it's much easier to have a relationship with a person if there's some kind of give and take, right? If there's some kind of common base you can build. And that's just very hard to do for Jesus directly, right? Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus, the carpenter's son, Jesus who was living in a society 2,000 years ago in Bethlehem or Jerusalem. It's much harder to relate to that person as a person. It's much easier to relate to them as kind of an abstract concept, right? And I think the abstract concept isn't as helpful, especially for our faith and what we believe about what it means to be a Messiah. So, but one thing about Father that I think is very powerful and is important to remember is when Father started speaking, when the church was founded in 1954, and if you read those early speeches from the 50s and 60s, Father almost every service was talking about Jesus. That was his focus, right? And he was talking about Jesus in a very, very personal way, in a way no one had ever done before. And if you think about kind of Korean culture at that time, it was very much kind of very Christian focused, very inspired by Christianity, very evangelical, very devoted Christians. And so Father was really talking to this group of Korean Christians about Jesus in a very personal way. And I really believe there was a very clear reason for that, because what Father was trying to teach, what Father was trying to help Christianity understand was Jesus, the person, the individual, who was a person trying to change the world and trying to teach people about God's heart, right? Father did not start going, I'm the Messiah, here's the principle, here's the parallels of history and the providence of restoration, Adam and Eve, Noah's family, that Father first focused on teaching about Jesus. And he really taught that Jesus was a very lonely person, and a very frustrated person. And I picked those two quotes because I feel like those two quotes in the Bible almost epitomize that very personal kind of loneliness that Jesus felt, that the Gospels weren't really aware about. They weren't writing a lonely Messiah, right? They were writing kind of a testimony of miracles and all these things that happened. They were trying to really get people to believe that Jesus was, the Son of God, right? But it still slipped out, because they were still close to the time Jesus was around, and those stories were floating around. And I feel like those two quotes really encapsulate the idea that Jesus was very, very lonely, right? And it almost seems like it slipped out randomly. Like a disciple said, I'll follow you wherever you go, right? Real inspired. And Jesus was like, I have nowhere to sleep at night, right? I have nowhere to call my home, right? It's a very lonely expression if you think about it. And the same when his family came to visit, and he was kind of, I think the context of that is they were coming to try to, they thought he was crazy and they were going to try to take him away and, lock him up almost. So he kind of knew their motivation wasn't to be with him or to spend time with him. And it was kind of a heartbreaking response to being told your family is there to tell the people you're with, they're not really my family, right? That's a heartbreaking thing to have to say and to believe and to interact with, right? So, this is what I mean by Jesus as a person is something that I think Father almost was unique in teaching people. And I think it's a very important kind of background to our church history and an understanding of where we come from and why we're here and what it means to be someone who follows God's will, tries to build a relationship with God. And of course, the last, and I didn't put it up in the reading, but the last part that really comes out in the Bible is Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? And whenever, I talk about Jesus with Christians, whenever I think about Jesus, I always come back to like that prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Where he goes 3 times, let this cup pass from me, right? And he's really begging God, not that he's afraid of death, but he's begging God to give him more time to try to fulfill his mission, right? And yeah, it's a very kind of powerful element of Jesus's heart. That even though it's been there, even though it was written in the Bible, it kind of got missed over. Like people didn't really understand it. And again, I think it's because they didn't see Jesus really as a person, right? But they saw him as, part of a Trinity, part of a divine being, right? So I do think it's very, very important whenever we speak of Jesus, whenever we think of Jesus. And of course, this time of year is the time we do that the most because we're celebrating what he did and what he accomplished, is that we try to really tap into and understand the heart of Jesus as a person like us, right? A person who lived at a time, who had a mission and was trying to accomplish it, right? Because I think it's important to acknowledge that he really succeeded in doing something out that no one else had done at that time, right? Because all of us were trying to become spiritual beings. We're trying to become divine spirits, right? And we're very lucky because we have a lot of support, right? We have our families, we have the principal, we have parents on earth, we have our communities. And Jesus, in a way, had none of that, right? He had his disciples who were always falling asleep and arguing among themselves about who deserved to be the top disciple, right? Like we're talking about a very difficult group of people to work with, right? But even despite his environment, he was able to succeed and become a divine being, to be able to hit that level of a relationship with God where he really connected to God. He had a direct relationship with God. And that's something we're all trying to do, right? We're all really trying to become divine beings. We're trying to connect to God's heart. And I always remember when I was 12, I was overly confident and naive. I might still be that way. I'm not sure. I've grown out of large portions of it, but I definitely retain some of my naive optimism and overconfidence. But excited, inspired 12-year-old me was talking to a friend of mine who was literally the exact opposite character. And I was like, we can all become like Jesus, right? We all have, no original sin. We're in the same position as Jesus. We can all become like Jesus, right? And he just scoffed at me and just like this kind of expression, right? Like didn't say much, but it was he scoffed so hard that I doubted that I could ever do it, right? It was just like a really kind of humbling experience, right? And it was like, okay, maybe it's a little harder than I thought, right? And so, and then I also remember when I was young, my dad told me that, he had a very close friend that he was really starting to try to witness to, right? And the friend was very, of course, he always felt like the children were like an example of the principle in action, right? He really felt blessed children and blessed families really should be like the example of the principle. And so he was trying to explain to this friend about lineage, and he made a comment like, she was complimenting, us as kids because, kids are cute. It's easy to compliment them. And my dad was like, well, they were born under the star of Bethlehem, right? And I'm like, God, Dad, that's a lot of pressure to put on us. Because then I was like 14, 15, like just slightly more realistic, right? So I was like, geez, it does make it hard to be humble when your dad's telling people you're born under the star of Bethlehem, right? But I think there is like that little bit of truth there about what we're trying to accomplish, right? And also the separation we put between us and Jesus is almost a way to it's almost an excuse to some level, right? And obviously, there is something different about Jesus and his circumstance that made it easier for him, despite it being very difficult. He had, my guess, if I had to guess, he had a very different lineage. He had a lineage that was very specifically prepared. And also as part of that, he probably had a lot less ancestral sin and a lot less ancestral influence. But to some extent, that's a little bit of a cop-out, right? Or a little bit of an excuse. Because again, I think it's, even Jesus himself was trying to send this message to people that the mission, the responsibility is to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And even he said once, like, yes, I am in the Father and the Father's in me. And that's like the quote Christians use to kind of explain the Trinity. But right after that, he says to his disciples, and you are in me and I'm in you, right? So the standard is very clear. The path is hard. It's obviously a difficult path. But the path Jesus is laying out is that everyone can do this. Everyone should do this. And I think this is why it's so important to be able to understand Jesus as a person who accomplished this unity with God, this standard of perfection, right? And I think, when we're able to disconnect Jesus from this kind of God status or his divinity, it actually makes it more impressive what he did, right? Because we know how hard it is to become divine spirits. We know how hard it is to overcome our own fallen nature. And Jesus didn't magically do that. He had to also go through that process, right? He didn't just, at 12, he was teaching in the temple, but he wasn't perfect at 12, right? He was still on the path, and he could only really start his mission at 30. And why is that, right? Well, there were a lot of steps in between. There was a lot he had to learn. There was a lot he had to go through. So, so I think, I think that it's really crucial in our own lives of faith that we can connect actually not just to Jesus, but to all the historical figures and to true parents as people, right? And actually, I think that extends beyond the saints and famous people of history. I think it's also crucial to see that in each other. That's kind of the second point I feel is very important when I'm reflecting on this, trying to understand Jesus as a person, even though there's only limited knowledge of who he was as a person, right? We don't have videos. We don't have his whole life story. We have very small snapshots of what he did and what he accomplished and what he said. So of course, it's very hard to be able to connect with him because the rest is like guessing, right? The rest is just stories that people told or theology built on top of what he said. But still, we can make the best effort we can to see the person behind them. And I also think that extends to all our relationships. It's very easy to look at someone and kind of build up a concept of them, even based on our give and take with them. But I think always when we're interacting with people, we see them, through some lens, right? And of course, that's unavoidable. That's just reality. We're going to see people kind of as best we can. I think it's important to remember that we're not really seeing the full person, that there's a deeper level that we have to try to find and connect with, right? And I think that's very much the path, the same path that we're talking about when we're talking about Jesus's life, right? And Jesus's path and Jesus's process is that skill of learning how to really see the true core of people, right? Maybe in principle terminology, we talk about seeing people from God's viewpoint. And, something I worry about is if something similar will happen with true parents when they pass, right? That we stop seeing them as like real people that were running around and meeting with people and talking with people and, giving talks and starting businesses and going fishing, right? And singing songs, right? And we just see them as like a theology, right? As just like we start to distance ourselves from the person who is, father and mother. And I think that'll be harder because we have so much good content, right? We have videos, we have direct speeches. And I think that is what will really make a difference, right? Because people will be able to really like study true parents on a personal level and really have a lot of good material to do so. But I think, as we're reflecting on Christmas time, of course, Christmas time is a time for presents and a time, to celebrate our Santa and our elves and our Christmas trees, right? But we all know that that's the fun part. That's the that's the family part that brings us together. But we do want to remember kind of the mission underneath, right? And the person underneath. And so that's what I would really encourage everyone to take time to do over Christmas. I mentioned in the email that we're going to have, Mother was actually thinking and, encouraging everyone to have a Sunday service around Jesus and around Christmas. I don't think that's practical for us because everyone's going to kind of be in their homes and in their families. I mean, I'll be out in the countryside. But I do want to take some time, to have on Christmas Eve, to have like a Zoom Hundoke, and just to kind of read through the Gospels and read through some of the things that Jesus did and said, and just kind of share about that, see if we can really connect then as a community to who Jesus was, again, as a person. If he was here today, what kind of person would he be, right? What would Jesus be saying about Gaza or Ukraine, right? It's everyone thinks they know. I'm not sure I'm so sure, right? But I think it's a way to help us relate to someone as a real person. Like, what would they be like here today if they were our neighbor, if they were living with us, right? And I would encourage everyone on your own, if you can't make the Hundoke, or even if you do, to try to read about, take the time during Christmas, to read the Gospels again, to read the the story of Jesus's life and the things he did. Because it's a perfect time of year to do it, right? And I think there's still a lot we can learn from the life of Jesus and the story of Jesus, right? And I do try to read the Gospels, every now and then. I want to say once a year, but I'd be lying. It's probably once every 2 or 3 years, right? But every time I read it, it reminds me and gives me kind of fresh perspective, right? And it kind of does humble me in the sense that, it's very difficult to be that kind of person, right? And Jesus was that kind of person. And even with the snapshots we have, Jesus is such a unique person and really an example of a person who can love their neighbor, a person who can forgive, a person who can lead through an example, right? And actually, the principal perspective that I really feel is the miracles are such a distraction to that when you read the Bible. So many people fixate on the miracles, but you can see how the miracles blinded people to the kind of person Jesus actually was, right? And it's kind of a really fascinating dynamic. So I don't like to give homework when I give a Sunday service. So it won't be homework. It'll be a strong recommendation. But I would strongly recommend that everyone reads through over Christmas. And I think it's a good tradition, even the life of Jesus, right? We have kind of 2 weeks till the end of the year. Should be enough time to get through them. They're not that long, right? And I think it really adds value to our lives of faith and our view of the world and our relationships with people. So on that note, if everyone could join me for a prayer. Sarang Manashin Hanun Buonim. Our beloved and precious Heavenly Parent, as always, we're so grateful that we can stand here today and share about our lives of faith, about true parents, about Jesus who walked this earth over 2,000 years ago, that we can be grateful to be here because we all have in common our faith in true parents, our commitment to the blessing and the values of the principle. And so as we're here as a wider, really extended family and community, we pray we can really reflect on how we can really connect to your heart. The mission is always the same every day. Father always said it so clearly, to the two great loves of the world is to love God and to love each other. It's a constant challenge and a constant struggle and a constant effort to really challenge ourselves and to be able to be better sons and daughters, better brothers and sisters in our relationships, better husbands and wives, and better parents, not just to our own children, but to all the children of this world who really need that kind of unconditional love, that unconditional sacrifice that true parents and Jesus and actually many people throughout history have really tried to attain. So we're so grateful again for this time together. We really pray that this Christmas season can be one of joy and of really sharing and of growth, spiritual growth, and of genuine bonds of friendship and love. And we thank you and report all of this together in our names. In the name of Youngil and Vicky Lowe, a blessed central family. Aju. Okay, on that note, I think there's a lot of exciting announcements today. So I'll welcome our MC back up to close off the service and share the news. So